Rose garden rules used to be pretty strict. Whether it was a rose garden or a rose border, it was roses only, neat rows, gaps between them, and a great emphasis on perfection, on spraying and deadheading. But that's been changing for quite a few years now. And now the old assumptions about how you grow roses and how you use roses in your garden have been turned on their heads. It's Alexandra here from the Middle-Sized Garden YouTube channel and blog. And I went to David Austin Roses to talk to head Rosarian Liam Beddall. He explains why modern rose gardens are healthier, more natural, and easier to manage than many people realise. And we'll go into some practical advice on choosing roses, designing with them, dealing with pests and diseases, and combining them with other plants to create a garden that's beautiful for much longer than the traditional rose border. So let's find out what the new rules of rose growing are. So Liam, tell me what a rose garden is first.
Well, I guess a rose garden is a garden that has primarily roses in it. I think the definition of that is expanding nowadays slightly because people are using mixed planting, so herbaceous perennials, trees, shrubs perhaps, to extend the season of interest, reduce monoculture and reduces disease and pest pressure as well. But primarily it should have the majority being roses.
And so where would someone start if they want to create a rose garden or part of their garden that is a rose garden?
I think you've got to think about the sort of feeling that you're wanting to have first of all and the style first of all. So is it formal, informal, that kind of thing? Because if it's formal, you might be reducing your colour palette, you might be planting larger sways rather than lots of different plantings, you might be using just certain types of roses. Where if it's informal, you might be using a sort of more relaxed habit type plants, you might be using a wider colour palette. So I'd think about that first of all, and then it's all about choice, variety choice. So consult rose companies, rose experts, websites, books, but try and look for the healthiest varieties that are going to be, pest and disease free as is possible. Try and look for fragrant varieties that you can bring to the front of the border, but it's all about variety selection from the outset. And then really, I think the big thing for us that you'll notice in this garden is planting en masse. So even if you have a small space, I'd always say it's better to plant groups of a rose, so 3 Olivia Rose Austin, rather than one-offs of lots of different varieties, because it can look a bit patchy and it takes a little bit longer to get to maturity.
So how do you approach using roses as structural plants? For instance, as a focal point, having them in a hedge, in an arch, etc.?
There's lots of different ways. You mentioned a few good ones there. As a focal point, I think the key there again is planting a big enough group. So when we do large public-facing gardens, we might be planting in 3s, 5s, 7, 9s, 11s. The thing I hear most often in this garden of a lunchtime is, gosh, my roses don't look anything like that. But it's often because maybe somebody's planted one off of one variety rather than a bigger group. So of most varieties, we plant them about 2 foot, 60 centimetres apart, so they grow into each other to give you that. So that's one way to give you the structural. Hedge is a really great way of using roses. I don't think we do that enough in the UK. And generally planting a bit closer, so 50 to 60 centimetres apart, and they will give you then that continuity of flowering all the way through. Arches and structures are another one, so obelisks as well, but arches, maybe it's to frame an entrance, maybe it's over a seat. Try and choose the most fragrant varieties that you can enjoy from that space. And obelisks are great too, particularly in mixed borders if you want some height, because they not only bring flower and fragrance in the summer, but they also bring you structure in the winter. I think, again, variety choice is super important. Don't choose big 12, 15-foot ramblers for an obelisk. Look for your sort of 8, 10-foot climbers, perhaps, or repeat flowering ramblers. And even some of the lax shrubs, so Dame Judi Dench, Emily Bronte, Golden Celebration, the Lark Ascending.
What's the difference between a climber and a rambler, and what is each one best for?
Okay. Nowadays, the difference between those two is probably getting slimmer and slimmer because of modern breeding. But in 3 simple terms, climbing roses tend to have larger, more singly held flowers, whereas ramblers tend to have clusters of smaller flowers together. Climbers tend to repeat flower all the way through the summer, whereas ramblers in the main tend to flower once, so sort of 6 weeks in midsummer, and then they'll go on to perhaps produce hips. And then the climbers tend to be a little bit stiffer, whereas the ramblers tend to be a little bit more lax. So that might be great for growing through a tree or over an old oil tank or over a structure. In terms of climbers, they can be great on walls or fences where you can spread them out. Ramblers can be great into trees or maybe over a large pergola or over a shed. or maybe you wanted to spill over a wall and spill down the other side. Most ramblers are quite large, sort of 15, 20 foot plus, but there is a great group of repeat flowering ramblers now that repeat flower all the way through the summer, while still giving you that informal cottage garden feel of smaller flowers like Malvern Hills. Malvern Hills is sort of like the modern day equivalent repeat flower of something like Banksia lutea, which is a beautiful monster, but will get to 40 feet, whereas Malvern Hills will do about 15 feet. So generally a bit more flexible, smaller flowers, and a bit more lax.
In terms of colour, David Austin's really well known for its colour. So how do you plan colour in a rose garden?
I think if you are wanting a sort of more formal style, then you would probably restrict the amount of colour you're using. Perhaps you might be using pinks, whites and reds, or you might be using sort of yellows, oranges and apricot. In a more informal style, it's a lot easier to mix lots of different colours. These are all very basic rules. I think that colour with particularly the David Austin roses isn't as integral as people think, because the petals of the English roses, the David Austins, are quite translucent, so light passes through them. So colour actually changes quite a lot. If you look at Mr. Austin's first writings about Constance Spry, which he released in 1961, he talks about this purity of colour, pure pink, which you get with Constance Spry. Whereas nowadays, some of the more modern varieties like Emma Bridgewater, Eustacia Vi, Emily Bronte, they have hints of apricot in them. So they're warm pinks rather than cool pinks. And that's really good because it means you can mix them with other colours. So if you've got a warm pink like Emma Bridgewater, you can easily then transition into soft apricots like, Donahue, or maybe an orange like the Lady of Shalott. So don't be scared by colour. Don't let it put you off. And if somebody comes into your garden and says, it doesn't look right, then just don't invite them back, I would say.
Yes, that would be very rude. That's it. And what about the flowering season? Because we were talking about this earlier, saying that it used to be that the end of June was peak flowering for roses in the UK. It's now the end of May. That is the peak flowering season. So how do you manage to make sure that there's roses in this rose garden, that you've got these wonderful rose gardens that people come and see all year round? How do you manage to get that seasonal interest?
I think it's about, again, variety selection. I do think there's a bit of a difference between repeat flowering and continual flowering. Some varieties like Olivia Rose Austin, Cougar, Tottering by Gently, they seem to be producing flowers all the way through the summer. Whereas some varieties like the classic Gertrude Jekyll, with a wonderful old rose fragrance, certainly repeat flowers, but it flowers, has a rest and flowers again. So it's about mixing those varieties through. And also one thing that I would stress is when you're selecting varieties for the border in that respect, don't choose every rose just on the basis that it's doing everything. And what I mean by that is some people want every rose to be repeat flowering, be large flowers, fragrant, and they want everything to do everything. But some varieties like Nye Bevan, for example, very, very good repeat flower. Super continual flowering all the way through the summer. It's not a showcase bloom, but it's a very good repeat flower. So mixing those, what we might call background characters, with the main stars like, Princess Alexandra of Kent or Princess Anne, big showy flowers, is quite important. And having that range through there, and also a range of bloom shapes and fragrances.
Are there any roses or types of roses that you would particularly recommend for smaller spaces, smaller gardens and so on?
Yes. Nowadays, we're looking for all sizes of roses, so from really small shrubs right up to the larger ones. Some of the sort of more compact shrub roses of recent years would work really well. So Donahue, which is a really lovely soft apricot, has its really sort of peachy bud that opens up to soft apricot with a strong fruity fragrance, does very well, and that gets to about 3 foot. It has a rounded habit, which is really good. Scarborough Fair, a quite low-growing one that looks a bit like a blousy peony, but obviously repeat flowers all the way through the summer as well. So those are really effective, and one of my favourites is Eustacia Vi, which again is a warm pink, so sort of apricot-y pink. Very good, strong, fruity fragrance, but it starts as this apricot-y pink, and then as the flower ages, becomes more of a sort of soft alba pink. So that change is quite important, and that for me is really important with design, is that the flower doesn't stay the same. So the old hybrid teas of the 60s and 70s of that heyday of my grandparents and before was bright colours, real focus on the high point in the centre. As the flower opened, it became pretty flat, whereas what David wanted was the roses of the Dutch masters that sort of, as they aged, become more interesting in both range of shape and colour. And you can find those in some of those smaller ones we've mentioned.
Thinking about specific recommendations, What are your recommendations for a rose for a north-facing border?
Plenty of roses that work really well on a north-facing border, and it's a bit of a misconception that you can't use roses in that space. Roses are sun lovers, so as much sun as we can get is great, but as long as they're getting a minimum of 4 hours sunlight, and it is generally light and airy, then roses will do very well. I'm head Rosarian and I have a north-facing garden, and there's plenty of roses in there, so they'll do very well. If you're looking for shrubs, things like Princess Anne, very, very reliable, hardy, will grow anywhere really. Repeat flowers well with a sort of rich pink colour, that would work very well. Kew Gardens is one of the best for shade, and that has very few thorns and has these sort of clusters of white flowers in the sort of hydrangea-like panicle up above. And then perhaps behind you, if you've got a wall or a fence, something like Mary Delaney, the climber, would be very effective. It has sort of rich mahogany stems in the spring, so that can be quite nice when it's quite dark against the fence. And then these sort of pink water lily-like flowers that open up and as they reflect give you a bit of an old rose fragrance. If you've got a taller wall, the Generous Gardener would be great as well, which everybody knows, really great fragrance of mixed type and also great big hips. So if you don't deadhead one or two of the flowers, you'll get sort of colour then later on in the season.
Lovely, because it's the hips really that are the very last gasp of the rose in terms of what it's got to offer the garden.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we realised during the COVID lockdown was that when we had limited gardeners here in the garden was there wasn't enough people to do any deadheading and they were missing the odd bloom. And what you were finding is that some of the varieties that repeat flower very well, that were always deadheading to get more blooms, were giving us good hips as well. So it's worth just thinking about that with your varieties in the garden, working out where your peak is in terms of you being in the garden. If you're never in the garden in autumn, winter, you might not want to encourage too many hips, but depends on your season.
How late should you stop deadheading if you want lots of lovely rose hips?
Probably, I guess, sort of mid to end of September. One thing I will say is that if it's a repeat flowering rose that also gives hips, so let's take Tottering by Gently, if you deadhead completely after the first flush and then leave the second flush undeadheaded, what you might find is that the hips aren't as good as if you'd have left some of the first flush. So what I tend to do is on my Tottering by Gently is maybe a third of the flowers after the first flush, leave them undeadheaded, then I know I'm going to get a crop of hips as well. And to be honest, with the amount of flowers that it does, it's easy to miss one or two anyway and see that. But last year I tried not to deadhead them at all to see what would happen after the first flush. Fantastic hips, but the flowering wasn't as good as it could have been. So it's just a compromise between the two.
And of course, pests and diseases is the next thing we're going to talk about.
Okay.
What is your advice to an amateur rose grower who is worried about pests and diseases?
Don't worry too much about them. I think we discussed earlier about choosing the right plant for the right place and variety selection. That's really important. Some of the older varieties that people will know and love that are very readily available, Zephyr and Drouin, for example, great fragrance, very few thorns, but really, really poor disease. It won't know whether to get black spot, rust or mildew first. So you've got to really choose the right variety first of all, and that will give you good success. In terms of the diseases, black spot is probably the most common question we get asked about. If every year your rose is getting black spot and you've done all the things and pruned it well and fed it and kept it well watered and tried not to get the foliage wet and you're still getting a lot of black spot, then perhaps it's just not the right variety for that place. So thinking about that. In terms of pests, probably our worst pest is aphids, and they're not really that much of a problem. So just hold your nerves slightly, trust in the process of nature, and instead of spraying gaily with all sorts of chemicals and pesticides, try thinking about planting companion plants maybe around the rose that will bring in good bugs. So maybe it might be tagetes, French marigolds, it might be calendula, hot marigolds, maybe it's cosmos with the open flower that are going to bring in the good bugs and then reduce the bad bugs for you. But pest and disease shouldn't be an issue really with modern breeding the way that we're looking at for modern varieties. You've got to work out what your threshold for acceptance of disease pressure is. My threshold is pretty low in the respect that I can appreciate all types of flowers. If you want perfection, then you've just got to be really careful to choose the right varieties.
Yes, I agree. I think most of the time I sort of look at the aphids and think, must do something about that. And then 2 weeks later, sorted.
Exactly. I think that's the big thing, is holding your nerves slightly, perhaps blast them off with a hose pipe if you need to. But it's good to have a few aphids in the garden to keep the good bugs in action. But we use integrated pest management here in the garden, which is a system of introducing the eggs of good bugs that when the temperature is right will hatch to eat the bad bugs. But in a mixed garden, you wouldn't probably need that.
So is that nematodes? Or
No, it's
ladybird?
integrated pest management that might have ladybird, lacewings or hoverfly eggs in there, or it might be wasps, for example, that are reducing the population of certain things. Certainly we sometimes have a little bit of red spider mite, but again, that sorts that out. In a mixed garden, though, at home, we've only got roses here mainly, so it's a bit of a feast for the aphids. But once that population has sort of died off and been kept at bay by the ladybirds, lacewings, hoverflies and the other creatures, then it's not much of an issue. So I guess the key really is to mix in other plants with your roses.
And what other plants would you recommend? What are your top 5 plants to grow with roses?
I think one of my favourites is really simple. It's Nepeta. Nepeta is really, really good. I find it a lot better than lavender because it flowers for longer. Obviously, lavender with roses is very quintessentially English, but it's always confused me slightly because lavender likes very different conditions to the moisture-retentive soil that roses like. But Nepeta's great. Things like Nepeta Kit Kat we use, or perhaps Nepeta Junior Walker's Low. And what you want to make sure is that the roses have plenty of space at the roots because they don't like too much competition. So Nepeta is great. You can't really go wrong with geraniums, I don't think. Many of them will do very well. I love geranium Azure Rush, which is a sort of softer coloured sport of the Roseanne that everybody knows, but not necessarily as vigorous. Geranium Brookside, really, really lovely as well. And even some of the Phaeum geraniums work really nicely. Stachys lamb's ears is really nice because it's got that silver and that fine texture of the lamb's ears. That works really effectively, particularly with the cool pink roses, things like Olivia Rose Austin. We use a great one called Stachys byzantina Silver Carpet, which instead of having the sort of flowering spikes, just stays quite the foliage, so it just carpets underneath. And then anything that you can use to contrast against a rounded shape of roses. So perhaps something traditional like a foxglove, quite upright and vertical to give you that contrast. Sutton's apricot works really effectively with the apricot. Donahue or maybe native shallot. And then also maybe to fill out the space around salvia. Salvia caradonna, for example, really, really effective. Flowers for a long season. And there's a bit of something in the fact that it's got a bit of sulphur in the scent profile, which perhaps helps reduce black spot in a way. But it's got a long flowering season, is very, very attractive to pollinators. So they're all very simple and perennials that you can get in your local garden centre, but try not to overcomplicate it. Make sure there's plenty of space around the rose. Leave a minimum of about 50 centimetres at the roots, just to make sure that the rose can establish and the perennials too.
So if you are like me, listening to this and thinking, oh my goodness, my roses are in the wrong place.
Yes.
And actually, some of my roses are very old. They've been in the house much longer than I have.
Yes.
And so I'm thinking about replacing them. So What do I do then? Can I replace roses with roses? Because there's this rose sickness thing.
Yeah, rosary plant sickness is not necessarily a very, very well-researched thing, and there's lots of heated discussion amongst other experts in the industry about what you can and can't do. But there's an idea if a rose has been in the soil and you take it out and put it back, another rose back in, that it's probably taken away a lot of the goodness from the soil and perhaps left something behind that might affect the next rose. 2 simple things you could do. You could plant a little bit further away in a different space where roses haven't grown before. But what we tend to do is dig down to about 18 inches deep and wide and replace that soil with soil from a different part of the garden that hasn't had roses in before, or fresh soil, to give the rose a good start. Essentially, don't put a £30 rose in a 30p hole. Really improve the soil, give it a good start. You've got one opportunity to do that. And if you think a rose might last 15, 20, 25 years, maybe longer if you look after it, it's really worth the investment.
And what about the planting in a box? Somebody once told me, they said, if you put the new soil in a box and then it'll slowly, the cardboard of the box will slowly rot and reincorporate into the soil. And by that time, everyone will be happy and established.
I think if you are doing 1 or 2 roses in a mixed border, it's worth doing. If you were doing a whole garden, you'd need a lot of boxes and that would be quite challenging. We have tried it with the odd spot planting and I can't say I've noticed a huge difference. But the idea there principally is you dig your hole, put your cardboard box in, still fill it with fresh soil and put that rose back in there so that by the time the root system establishes and the box breaks down, we've got a good strong root system that will perhaps fight off any nasties in the soil. But I guess what we're talking about in all these instances is just looking after your soil, mulching every year with a good organic matter, keeping your soil in good health, and the rose should do fine from there on in.
So what's the most common mistake people make when they try to add roses to their garden?
That's easy. It's putting the wrong plant in the wrong place. And I know we talked about that a lot, but you see many examples of people putting a rambling rector on a 6-foot fence and then losing the fence panel within a couple of years when it's taken over. Or it could be that they put a large shrub in a border where they're trying to get their car door open on the driveway. So it's really just about doing the research in the time that you've got. Winter's great. Winter's cold and dreary and wet and miserable, so it's a really great time to plant. And then also you're in the way of the bare root season as well, so you've got time to get it in that sort of colder period where the roots can establish. But simple is choosing the right plant, putting it in the right place and improving the soil.
And what's the best time to plant roses?
Depends. Potted roses can be planted all year round, so if you're receiving a gift or perhaps you're out of the bare root season, potted roses are great. Bare root roses that we sell can be planted between November and the end of April. Some growers finish at the end of February. We've got really high-tech storage here and we can keep them nice and cool and damp up until the end of April. I find that if you can get them done between November and the sort of end of February, that's really great because it tends to be plenty of moisture in the ground, which means that the rose can establish really well. The great thing about bare roots are they're economic. You get more variety, a general sort of larger range. But also when you plant that bare root rose, there's no flowers, there's no foliage, so it can establish a good strong root system. It's only got to think about that before it starts producing the flowers next year. When you plant a potted rose, if you buy a potted rose from us here in the summer and it's in lovely flower and you take it home and you plant it and you're very careful, when you take it out of the pot and you put it in the ground, sometimes that potted rose can sulk for a week or two because it was really happy in its nice pot and all of a sudden you've pulled it out and disturbed the root system. Totally normal. Just water through it. It's just gone into a bit of shock and it will pick itself up. But with the bare roots, you just get the time to establish. Both are absolutely fine. It depends on the season.
And is there anything we need to know about roses in containers?
Yes, I think 2 things. Make sure you've got a big enough container and make sure that you've got a good growing medium mix. So by big enough container, probably a minimum of 18 inches, 50 centimetres deep and wide. The bigger the better. When a rose is in a container, it's completely dependent on you and I. So we have to make up for the watering and the feeding that it would do for itself in the ground. A big pot, 18 inches deep and wide. Try and avoid those black plastic ones from the respect that they can cook the roots if they get quite hot. So that's what I would say. And then from a growing medium, we generally recommend a 50-50 mix of a peat-free multi-purpose and something like a peat-free John Innes and mixing those through. The multi-purpose aerates the John Innes, which on its own can be a little heavy, whereas the John Innes brings some weight to the pot and moisture retention. When you're choosing your rose for your containers, always look in the description for those key words like bushy, rounded, because they're going to give you that rounded shape in a pot. If it says it's arching or upright and you put it in a pot, it's going to be like that or spill over. So if that's not the effect you want, look for those key words. And then finally, remember from a feeding point of view and watering, it's just you and me doing it. So keep them well watered. With the peat-free compost, our experience is better to water them little and often, i.e. not to let the soil dry out because it can be really hard to re-wet it. And then every couple of weeks during the growing season, you might consider watering in some liquid feed. So tomato feed, maybe seaweed. Water that into the pot because every time you're watering, you're washing out a lot of the goodness. But by topping that up with liquid feed, that gives it a bit of boost. And you can do that really from probably the end of May right up until sort of mid to late September.
So if you'd like advice on choosing roses for fences, arches, pergolas and obelisks, then don't miss this next video coming up. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.